Okay, so you got a little snapshot of who Paul is. And as you grow closer to Jesus, you start to learn more about who Jesus is, it will be almost impossible for you to not also get to know who Paul was. Paul was a very important person in the ministry of Christ and the early church. His name comes up all the time. So it's good for you to get an idea of who this man is, where he started, and we didn't really get talking about that very much. Today's lesson is going to kind of open up a little bit about that second video that you watched. You saw in that video that Paul wrote a lot of letters. I think Paul probably wrote a lot more letters than we actually have written in our word, but some of those letters God chose to put in the Bible for us to read too. I think those messages were meant for all of us, not just the city that he was writing to. Today, we're going to talk about the letter he wrote to the Philippians. He had so much love for these people. He had been a very important part of building that church. And so when he was in prison and he wasn't able to get to them, he wanted to encourage them and tell them how proud of them he was and how much he knew that God was pleased with their growth and the way that they were living for Jesus. So he wrote them a letter. And it's interesting that Paul wrote a letter encouraging these people to be filled with joy while he was sitting in prison. It doesn't seem like the kind of place that he would want to be. It doesn't seem like the kind of place that would make him feel very joyful. But that's one of the points that I really want us to understand about Paul and what he was saying in this passage. Comfort does not equal contentment. Let's kind of unpack that statement. All right, so first let's talk about what contentment is. I looked up contentment to get some synonyms, some definitions of what contentment means. And this is what the dictionary told me. Contentment is a state of peaceful happiness. Contentment is a state of satisfaction. And contentment is a state of the ease of the mind. All of those things sound so peaceful and calm and like you're just getting everything that you really want. That's what it means to be content. Having what you want, right? That's what that definition sounds like to me. Well, then if I think about Paul talking about contentment while he's sitting in jail, I don't feel like that was a very peaceful and happy place, and I don't think he was very satisfied, and I certainly don't know that he had a ease of mind. I mean, I wasn't in his mind, but I'm thinking that it wasn't very comfortable. And yet, Paul was content. Now, this is where the secret comes in. Paul tells us in this passage about discovering the answer to a secret. So let me read to you what he said, and then we'll talk about what it means. In Philippians chapter 4, we're going to start with verse 11, the second part, and I'm going to read all the way through to verse 13. Okay, so Paul says this: I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. So Paul was saying that contentment was not about having a lot of money, having enough food, being very comfortable. He was saying that contentment had something to do with Jesus. And it completely goes against what the dictionary tells us. The dictionary doesn't say anything about Jesus. So as we grow and learn more about God, we start to realize that some of the things that the dictionary tells us, or our friends tell us, or we learn in school, some of those things are a little bit different when we're talking about Jesus. Paul did not have a lot of easy moments. From the time that he chose to follow Jesus until the day that he died, he lived in a lot of discomfort. I have a list right here. It tells me all of the different ways that Paul was uncomfortable. Let me tell you some of these things. This tells me that Paul was beaten. Paul was actually stoned once. Paul was in a shipwreck. Like the ship got wrecked onto an island, and they were far away from where they were supposed to be. And then when he got off the ship, he got bitten by a snake. Paul was whipped just like Jesus was 5 different times. Paul spent most of the time in his life after he chose to follow Jesus never living in the same place for very long. He traveled all over the place. He lived in friends' homes. He spent a lot of time living in a prison cell. His friends and the people that he were supposed to be on his side, they often turned their back on him or betrayed him somehow. The people he was preaching to, the Gentiles, those that he was sharing the love of Jesus with, sometimes they turned their backs on him. He spent time in the cities. He spent time in the wilderness. He spent time at sea. He had a lot of times where he wasn't able to sleep. He spent a lot of time hungry and thirsty. So Paul's life was not comfortable. Paul didn't have peaceful happiness or satisfaction or ease of mind. A lot of times Paul's life was threatened. And even though all of those things were happening in Paul's life, Paul still was able to say to the Philippians that he is full of contentment. Why is that? Why was he able to know what it was to be content, no matter what was going on around him? This verse right here is the secret. This is what he shares. I can do all this. I can be hungry. I can be thirsty. I can be lonely. I can be scared. I can be in jail. I can be on the ocean. I can be far away from home. I can do all of that because I have Jesus strengthening me. This is a beautiful secret, and it might be one of the most important things I can teach you ever. It doesn't matter what happens around you. It doesn't matter if everything in your day works out the way you want it to, or if nothing in your day works out the way you want it to, because Jesus is the strength that you need to be content. We spend a lot of our time and our energy collecting things. Maybe you have a list of birthday wishes or Christmas wishes, things that you'd like to have. I know my kids could tell me in a heartbeat what toys they'd like me to buy them. Or maybe you have big dreams of going places and seeing things. Maybe you want to travel to Greece or Italy, or maybe you want to go to Hawaii. Maybe your absolute favorite thing in the world is to go visit a grandpa's house or a grandma's house. And you're thinking about all these things that you want to do, and these experiences or belongings would be the things that would make you finally happy. But the reality is that we will never find contentment there. We will never find peaceful happiness or satisfaction or ease of mind if we have all of those things and none of Jesus. The secret is that we have to have Jesus to give us the strength to find our happiness. It doesn't mean that it's wrong to be happy or to want those things. It just means that our answer doesn't lie in all the things and all the places and all the people. It lies in Jesus only. And that is what allows a person to walk through very difficult circumstances and still be filled with joy way down deep in her heart, because she has Jesus. I can tell you, I know all about that. And if I didn't have the joy of Jesus way down deep in my heart, I would find some days to be pretty gloomy. But because of Jesus, he pulls me up and he reminds me that he is my strength. I don't have to find the strength myself. So let's keep that thought in our mind all the time. Contentment does not equal comfort. We will not find our fullest happiness just by having the things we want or the things we think we need or going the places we want to go. We can do those things and they will bring us wonderful feelings, but the joy that we want to get through life, that comes from Jesus only. Paul was a great example because Paul was not telling us this sitting in a really comfortable chair with his, Xbox controller in his hands and eating his favorite snack food while somebody was cleaning his house and getting out all of his toys out for him to play with. Paul was telling us this sitting in a very lonely, cold, dark jail cell. He knew all about what it meant to be truly content. And so we can look at a person like Paul and we can say, I trust that. If he's able to say that, sitting where he's sitting, then I know there must be something to it. I love that Paul was a great example of where we find true joy. I want to think a little bit about our hide and seek question because, of course, we are going to review. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding comes from Proverbs so many hundreds of years before Paul was living and writing to the Philippians. And yet I think Paul is a great example of following these words. He had to put his trust in the Lord. He couldn't lean on his own understanding because leaning on his own understanding would have led him to despair and loneliness and sadness. Instead, he chose to trust in the Lord. So when we think about that verse and how it applies to Paul, I have these questions for you, and you're going to have to dig way deep in your brain for these. So here we go. What do you think Paul would say about leaning on his own understanding? So talk that through with your parents. What would he say about that? Would he say it's a good idea? Would he say that it makes sense? You can take a look at some of the experiences that Paul has had, and you could use those experiences to help you answer that question. And then the second question, what are some ways Paul showed that he trusted God? His whole life of ministry is a great big picture of trusting God. So comb through with your parents and see if you can come up with some ideas, some examples of how Paul showed that he trusted God no matter what was going on. You're going to probably need your parents' help a little bit because they probably know some more examples of Paul's life and could help you with some of those. So definitely ask them for some help. This is a great conversation for the whole family to have. I'm going to add Paul's name to our list. We have quite the list. We are almost finished with our lists for this series. So I want to talk about that just for a second with you. You can see I have the names of all the different people that we've met as we've been on this journey to answer this question. Is trust a must? So what I would like for you to do, because next week we have a lesson and it's the last one in this series. And we're going to talk some in our session next week about this list of people. So you can start thinking about them now. And if you have been keeping your hide and seek chart, then just pull yours out and you can see all the names of the people we've discussed. I want you to think about who we've met. And I want you to think about how each one of those people would answer this question. We're going to talk about that next week, but you can start thinking about it now. How would those disciples on the road to Emmaus have answered the question? Is trust a must? What information would they have given you if you asked them that question? How do you think Job would have answered that question? Or Daniel? Think about those two men and the things they struggled with, losing everything they had or being thrown in with some lions. How do you think Jochebed would have answered that question, sending her sweet baby boy in a basket down the river? Or Abraham, who'd been told something by God and so many years later he finally saw it happen. How would he have answered this question? And of course, Paul, what would Paul have to say? The question, is trust a must? It's kind of another way of asking, do we really need to trust in God? Is that important? Does it make a difference? Does it matter? So we have some people whose lives show us some answers to that. I'd like for you to be thinking about that ahead of time. And next week, we're going to have our normal lesson, and then I'll finish it up by looking over the entire group of people that we've been learning about. And then we're going to think, how would they answer that? What would they have to say to us about whether or not it's worth our time and energy to put our trust in God? Okay? That's a big question. But I know that you guys have some really big conversations, and I know that the conversations you have with your parents will be so interesting. I wish I could be a part of them with you. Well, my loves, it's time to wrap up another Sunday. I hope that you enjoy the videos that you saw. I did put a coloring page on there for you with one of the verses that we've been discussing in our lesson. And there's quite a few video resources that if you want to go back and watch again, I hope you will. Paul is a beautiful example, just one more person that God shows us of an everyday human being who makes mistakes and does things that he wishes he didn't do, but still loves God with his whole heart. And we get to see what Jesus was able to do on the inside of Paul's heart, because Paul decided that he was going to trust in the Lord and not his own understanding. Okay, enjoy your lessons and your music, and I will see you around. Have a good week.